The letter that saved 40 lives was written in pencil on the back of a seed catalog, and by the time anyone in Cotters Reach thought to read it, the snow had already climbed past the second-story windows of the Methodist church. That was February 1888. The blizzard was 11 days old, and Frank Mullen was standing in the middle of his general store staring at floorboards he had not seen bare in 15 years. The shelves behind him were empty. The barrels were empty. The back room, where he kept the reserve flour and the good coffee, was empty. Outside, the wind had not stopped screaming since the last week of January, and the supply wagon from Fort Benton, the one he had promised would come, the one he had staked his winter accounts on, was somewhere out on the plains or nowhere at all. He had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. Neither had anyone else on Main Street, yet a rumor had begun moving through the drifts. Quiet at first, passed between the few families still able to break trail between houses. Someone at the north edge of town still had a warm kitchen. Someone was pulling food out of the ground, jar after sealed jar, and setting hot plates in front of children who had spent the last week chewing boiled harness leather. The name attached to the rumor made Frank Mullen set his jaw and turn away when he heard it. Margaret Halstead. The widow he had mocked from his own porch not 6 months earlier. The woman he had called a fool, loud enough for half the town to hear, when she started digging trenches along her barn wall in the last soft weeks of autumn. The woman whose husband he had watched buried on a raw April morning, and whose land he had already begun quietly counting as his own. She was, according to the rumor, feeding the town. Frank did not believe it at first. He walked to his front window and scraped a small circle in the frost with the edge of his thumb. Beyond the glass, Cotters Reach lay under a weight of snow so complete that the shape of the street itself had disappeared. Roofs were the only landmarks left. A few of them had collapsed in the night. He could see the broken line of the Petersons' barn from where he stood, folded in on itself like a paper box left out in the rain. Somewhere under those drifts, families were burning chair legs for heat and boiling bones they had already boiled twice. And on the north edge, half a mile past the last fence line, a thin, steady thread of smoke rose from a chimney that had no business still being warm. To understand how that chimney came to be the last one drawing in Cotters Reach, you have to go back to the previous summer, when Margaret Halstead did 3 things the town could not forgive her for. She refused to sell her husband's land. She ordered 80 clay jars from a potter 3 counties east, and she started digging. Samuel Halstead had died in the first week of April, taken by consumption after a slow winter of coughing blood into a rag he thought his wife did not see. He was 34 years old. He left behind 40 acres of Thin Creek pasture, a 2-room house he had built with his own hands, a bay mare named June, and a widow who had been raised in a Bohemian settlement in Nebraska and who spoke, when she spoke at all, with a soft weight on her consonants that told the town she was not one of them. The funeral was small. Frank Mullen attended, dressed in his good black coat, and he stood at the edge of the grave with his hat in his hand and his eyes on the creek pasture beyond the fence line. He was not a cruel man, Frank. He would have said so himself. He was a practical man, and practical men in a town like Cotters Reach understood that a widow with no children and no kin was not going to hold 40 acres of good bottomland through a hard winter alone. He gave her 3 months. 4 at the outside. Then he thought the land would come to him quietly at a fair price, and everyone would agree it had been for the best. Margaret Halstead did not sell. What she did instead began the talk that would carry her name through the drifts on the 11th day of the storm. The first of the clay jars arrived on a Tuesday in early August, hauled up from the depot in a battered wagon driven by a freighter who did not know Margaret Halstead and did not particularly care to. He unloaded 24 wide-mouthed vessels onto the packed dirt of her yard, took the folded bills she handed him, tipped his hat, and drove off before noon. The jars sat in the sun for the better part of an hour before Margaret came out of the house to look at them. She walked slowly along the line, running one hand across the smooth reddish clay. Each jar stood a little taller than her knee, thick-walled and heavy, with a narrow lip meant to take a wooden stopper and a bead of wax. They had been thrown by a Czech potter in a town called Prague, Nebraska, 3 counties east of the Missouri, and they had cost her most of what Samuel had left in the tin box under their bed. She had paid the freight herself in cash, which was the first thing the depot clerk mentioned to Frank Mullen when Frank came in that afternoon to collect his mail. Frank stood in the post office for a long moment after the clerk stopped talking. Then he walked back to his store and stood in front of his own shelves, flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, molasses, all of it stacked high and clean under the credit available sign, and he shook his head once slowly at what he took to be a woman who had lost her grip on the world. By the following Tuesday, another shipment had come. Then another. By the end of the month, 80 jars stood in neat rows along the south wall of Margaret's barn, and half the town had ridden past to look at them. The digging started in the first week of September. Margaret came out of the house at first light with a spade over her shoulder and a length of twine wound around her forearm, and she began marking a line in the sod 10 paces off the barn wall. She staked the twine at both ends, straightened it, and drove the spade into the dirt. Then she dug. She dug through the cool part of the morning and stopped when the sun climbed high, and she came out again in the long evening and dug until the light failed. The first trench ran 40 feet. The second ran 40 feet parallel to it. The third was still being cut when Frank Mullen rode out on a Sunday afternoon to see the thing for himself. He brought 2 men with him. Ed Cavett, who worked his loading dock, and a rancher named Hollis Bream who owed Frank money and laughed at Frank's jokes as a matter of habit. The 3 of them reined up at Margaret's gate and sat their horses for a while without dismounting. Margaret was in the second trench, up to her thighs in the earth, working steadily. She had tied her hair back with a strip of blue cloth. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. She did not look up when the horses stopped at her fence. Frank leaned forward on his saddle horn. His voice carried easily across the yard. "Mrs. Halstead, that's a lot of ground for one woman to be moving." Margaret straightened. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist and looked at him without expression. "It is. You planning to plant something down there?" "No." Frank waited for more. When it did not come, he glanced sideways at Hollis Bream, and Hollis Bream produced the small, tight laugh he was there to produce. Ed Cavett kept his mouth shut because Ed Cavett was the kind of man who watched more than he spoke, and something about the widow's face had bothered him from the moment he rode up. Frank tried again. "I've got flour by the barrel at the store, ma'am, sugar, salt pork. Anything you need to lay in for winter, you come see me. Credit's good. Widow like yourself, I could work out terms." Margaret rested one hand on the handle of the spade. She looked at Frank Mullen for a long, quiet moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the soft weight of the country she had come from. "I do not need credit, Mr. Mullen." Then she bent and drove the spade back into the earth. Frank rode off laughing. By that evening, half of Cotter's Reach had heard the story, and by the end of the week, the widow in the trenches had become the town's favorite piece of Sunday conversation. The talk in Cotter's Reach ran along familiar lines that autumn. It ran through the pews of the Methodist Church on Sunday morning, through the back room of the barbershop on Tuesday afternoon, through the long counter at Mullen's General Store, where men gathered to warm their hands at the stove and trade whatever news the week had produced. And nearly every one of those conversations, sooner or later, came back to the widow Halstead and her jars. Some of the talk was cruel. Most of it was not. The town was, on the whole, a decent town. Cotter's Reach sat at the elbow of the Musselshell River in eastern Montana, 4 days by wagon from the nearest railhead, and the people who lived there had come up together through the hard years of the early 80s, when the winters had killed cattle by the thousand and the drought summers had killed hope by the acre. They knew what it was to lose a husband. They knew what it was to bury a child. When Margaret Halstead had stood at Samuel's grave in April with her eyes dry and her hands folded in front of her, the women of the town had understood exactly what that dryness cost. But the jars were something else. The jars were foreign. The digging was foreign. And Margaret herself, though she had lived in Cotter's Reach for 11 years, had never quite stopped being foreign either. She had come out of a Bohemian settlement south of the Platte, one of the small pockets of Czech and Moravian families who had crossed the ocean in the 70s and put down roots in the tallgrass country of Nebraska. Samuel Halstead had ridden through the settlement on a horse-buying trip in the spring of 1877 and had come back a month later with Margaret at his side and a marriage certificate signed by a priest whose name he could not pronounce. She had been 19 years old. She had spoken careful, deliberate English, learned from a Methodist missionary who visited her grandmother's kitchen on Wednesdays. She had brought with her a wooden trunk containing 3 dresses, a black shawl her mother had woven, a small brass icon of a saint the Cotter's Reach women did not recognize, and a folded sheet of paper covered in her mother-in-law's handwriting. That last item, the folded paper, was what mattered now. Samuel's mother had been called Ainge Halstead before she became Agnes Halstead, and she had grown up in a village in the Bohemian Hill country, where winter came down out of the mountains for 4 months at a stretch, and no wagon reached the door from November to March. Her mother and her mother's mother, and every woman in that village going back longer than the parish records could follow, had kept their families alive by putting food into the ground, not in root cellars, not in barrels, in sealed clay vessels buried below the frost line, packed with salt and fat and smoked meat, opened one at a time through the long white months. Agnes had taught the method to Margaret in the last summer of her life, in the kitchen of the small house Samuel had built for his mother behind their own. She had written it down in check, with rough English notes in the margins for the measurements, and she had pressed the folded paper into Margaret's hands the week before she died. "You will not always live where the wagons come," she had said in her thick, slow English. "The ground is a good neighbor. The ground does not forget." Margaret had kept the paper folded in her Bible for 9 years. She had not needed it. Samuel had been alive, and the wagons had come, and Frank Mullen's shelves had been full, and there had been no reason to trench the yard behind the barn or to send $80 to a potter in Nebraska for jars that most of Cotter's Reach considered decorative at best. Then Samuel had died. And Margaret had taken the paper out of the Bible in the 2nd week of May, and she had sat at her kitchen table for a long time reading the tight brown handwriting of a woman who had been dead for 6 years. And she had come to a decision that had nothing to do with Frank Mullen or his credit, or the opinion of a town that had never quite decided whether she belonged in it. She was going to put her winter in the ground. The work went on through September and into the first cold week of October. Margaret rose before the light and was in the trenches by the time the sun cleared the low hills east of the creek. She stopped at mid-morning to feed the chickens and see to the bay mare, then returned to the digging until the sun climbed high. In the long afternoons she worked in the smokehouse. In the evenings she worked in the kitchen. By the time the first hard frost crept across the bottom land, she had lost weight from her cheeks and gained a callus across the palm of each hand thick enough to strike a match on. What she was doing in the smokehouse was the part of the process that would have puzzled the town most if the town had bothered to look inside. She had bought a steer from a neighbor in early September, a small red heifer past her milking years, and she had butchered the animal herself over the course of 3 days with a knife she kept honed on a river stone. The meat she cut into strips, salted heavily, and hung on wooden racks above a low, slow fire of green hickory and applewood. Some she smoked for 3 days, some she smoked for 5. When the strips came down off the racks, they were dark and hard and would keep, sealed properly, for a year or more without spoiling. The fat she rendered in a great iron kettle set over coals in the yard. She skimmed the pale gold liquid off the top and poured it, still warm, into the clay jars Agnes had specified for rendered tallow. She packed the smoked meat into other jars, layer by layer, each layer sealed under a thick pour of fat that hardened as it cooled and locked the meat away from air. She put dried beans into jars by the pound, and dried apples from her own 2 trees, and cornmeal ground fine at the mill in Roundup, and small hard rounds of a white cheese she had made in the manner her mother had taught her, wrapped in cloth and sealed under wax. Each jar was stoppered with a plug of hardwood cut to fit the mouth, then sealed with a rim of melted beeswax poured from a copper ladle. Each jar was labeled on a slip of paper tied around its neck with twine. Fat, beans, cornmeal, beef smoked 5 days, cheese sheep waxed. The handwriting was Margaret's, careful and small. The jars went into the trenches in a particular order. Agnes had been specific about this in the margins of her paper, and Margaret followed the instructions the way another woman might follow a recipe for bread. The jars of rendered fat went deepest, packed tight against the earth walls, because fat kept best in the coldest, most stable ground. Above them she laid the meat jars on their sides in beds of clean straw. Above those went the beans and the cornmeal, wrapped in oiled paper against damp. The cheese went nearest the surface, where the ground froze first and stayed frozen longest. Between the layers she packed dry straw and fine sand, and above the topmost jars she laid boards of rough pine, then a foot of sod cut in neat squares and fitted back into place. When she was finished with each trench, the ground looked no different than the rest of the yard. A stranger walking across the sod would not have known that beneath his boots lay enough food to carry a family through a Montana winter with room to spare. She finished the last trench on the 18th of October. That night she washed her face in cold water at the pump, sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of black tea, and wrote a single line in the ledger Samuel had used for the farm accounts. Cellar complete. 76 jars. Enough for one winter, or for many mouths in a hard one. She closed the ledger. She banked the stove. She went to bed. 2 miles south, in the back room of Mullen's General Store, Frank Mullen was going over his own accounts by the light of a good brass lamp. His shelves were fuller than they had ever been. The freight bill from Fort Benton had come in under budget. Credit had been extended to 11 families that autumn, and every one of them had signed a note against spring crops or fall cattle. Frank Mullen closed his ledger with satisfaction and poured himself a small glass of rye whiskey. Winter, he thought, was going to be a good one. The first snow came on the 2nd of November, light and dry, blowing in from the northwest on a wind that had a note in it the older ranchers did not like. It laid down 2 inches on the low ground and drifted 3 feet against the north side of every fence in the county, and by morning it was gone again, melted off by a sun that stayed warm through the middle of the day. The men at the counter of Mullen's General Store took it as a good sign. An early snow that went off clean, they said, meant a mild winter. Frank Mullen agreed with them. He had reason to. The second snow came on the 11th. It stayed. By the 15th there were 6 inches on the flat and drifts to the top rail of the corral fences, and the freight wagon that was supposed to have come up from Fort Benton on the 12th arrived 2 days late with the driver frostbit at the ears and the mules half dead in their traces. Frank unloaded the wagon himself, counted the sacks and the barrels against his order, and paid the driver in cash. Then he stood in the yard behind his store and watched the wagon pull away south, and for the first time that autumn he felt a small cold thing move through him that was not the weather. He put it out of his mind. He had reason to do that too. The store was full. The credit book was healthy. The town owed him more money than it had owed him in any November of the last 10 years, and every dollar of that debt was secured against land or livestock or the labor of grown men. Frank Mullen was, by any measure a practical man could apply, in the best position of his life. The talk about Margaret Halstead had quieted since the first frost. There were other things to talk about now. The Peterson boy had broken his leg falling off a barn roof. A rancher named McKay had lost 11 head to wolves in the coulees south of the river. The Methodist minister's wife was expecting a child at Christmas. Margaret and her jars slipped down the ladder of gossip, and by the middle of November most of the town had stopped thinking about her at all. She was in the store once, in that last week before the weather closed in. She came in on a Thursday morning with a small list written on the back of an envelope, and she bought lamp oil, and a spool of black thread, and a pound of coffee, and half a pound of hard peppermint candy that she paid for in silver coin. Frank Mullen waited on her himself. He was polite. He was always polite in the store, whatever he said on his porch. He wrapped her parcels in brown paper and tied them with twine and asked after her health, and she answered him in her careful, deliberate voice that yes, she was well, thank you, Mr. Mullen. He watched her out through the front window as she loaded the parcels into the small sledge she had pulled in behind the bay mare. She moved slowly. She looked thinner than she had at the funeral, and older, and there was something in the way she carried herself that Frank Mullen did not read at the time but would remember later, in the empty store, in the empty week that was coming. She looked like a woman who had finished something. The third snow came on the 22nd of November. It did not stop for 4 days. When it finally broke on the morning of the 26th, the drifts along the north wall of Mullen's general store stood higher than the front door, and it took Frank and Cavett 2 hours with shovels to clear a path to the road. The town dug out. The wagons ran again briefly. The freight from Fort Benton came up on the 2nd of December, late and short, with the driver reporting that the pass at Judith Gap was closing early this year, and that the next wagon might not make it through at all. Frank Mullen unloaded what there was, restocked his shelves, and told the men at his counter that the freight would come. It always came. There would be another wagon by Christmas, and another after the New Year, and Fort Benton had never yet failed to supply Cotter's Reach in the 15 years Frank had been running the store. The storm that would prove him wrong was already forming over the Rockies. It came down out of the north on the 28th of January, and the men who lived through it would speak of it for the rest of their lives as the Great Blow. The Weather Service in Bismarck would later record it as one of the 3 worst blizzards to cross the northern plains in the 19th century, worse in some respects than the January storm of 1888 that had killed the schoolchildren in Nebraska and Dakota Territory 2 weeks earlier. In Cotter's Reach, it began at dusk on a Saturday, quietly, with a fine dry snow that fell straight down for the first hour and gave no hint of what was riding behind it. By midnight the wind had risen. By dawn on Sunday, the wind was screaming across the plain at speeds no one in the town had a way of measuring, driving snow so fine and so hard that it packed itself into every crack of every building and drifted, inside houses, along the base of doors that had been sealed with rags. The temperature fell through Sunday and through Sunday night, and by Monday morning the thermometer nailed to the wall outside Mullen's general store read 41 degrees below zero, and the mercury had frozen solid in the bulb. The town did what towns did in such storms. Families gathered into single rooms and burned whatever wood they had. Men who tried to reach their barns to feed livestock went out on ropes tied to their back doors, and 2 of them, Amos Riley and a young hired hand whose name Frank Mullen could not remember afterward, did not come back. Riley was found in the spring against the north wall of his own smokehouse, 12 feet from the door he had been trying to reach. The hired hand was never found at all. The storm did not break on Tuesday. It did not break on Wednesday. On Thursday morning, the wind eased for perhaps 2 hours around noon, and Frank Mullen used those 2 hours to dig a path from his back door to his woodshed and to make a rough count of what remained on his shelves. The count was not good. He had expected it to carry him 3 weeks. He had extended credit against it as if it would carry him 3 weeks. But he had not counted on the whole town coming to him at once, and he had not counted on the freight wagon from Fort Benton failing to arrive on the 15th, and he had not counted on the second wagon, promised for the 24th, failing to arrive either. By Thursday afternoon the wind rose again, and the storm came back harder than before. It stayed hard through Friday and Saturday and into the second week, and by the time the first families began knocking at the back of the store to ask what could be spared, Frank Mullen was already rationing his own household to 2 meals a day. He gave what he could. He was not, at bottom, a hard man. He handed out flour by the cup and salt pork by the ounce, and he wrote each transaction into a small notebook he kept behind the counter because he did not yet understand that the notebook would not matter, that the debts he was recording would be paid in a currency the storm was already changing. On the 6th day of February, the last barrel of flour went out the door in the arms of a mother of 4 whose husband had not been able to reach his own woodpile in 3 days. On the 7th, Frank Mullen closed the store. He did not put a sign in the window. There was no need. The town knew. What the town did next was what towns had always done in such circumstances, which was to go quiet. Doors stopped opening. Chimneys stopped smoking, one by one, as the last of the wood piles gave out and families began burning furniture. On the 8th day, a rumor moved through the drifts that the Ostergaard family, 6 of them in a 2-room soddy on the west edge of town, had boiled the leather harness from their draft horse and eaten the broth. On the 9th day, the rumor was confirmed, and it was no longer only the Ostergaards. On the 10th day, in the middle of the afternoon, with the wind still screaming and the snow still driving sideways across a town that had disappeared, a boy of 11 named Wesley Peterson came knocking at Frank Mullen's back door. His mother had sent him. The boy stood on the step with his eyes streaming from the cold and told Frank, in a voice too tired to shake, that the widow Halstead was feeding people. Frank Mullen stood in the open doorway for longer than the cold allowed, staring down at the boy on his step, and the wind pulled the heat out of the room behind him in a single steady rush. He got the boy inside. He sat him by the stove. He gave him a cup of hot water with a spoonful of sugar stirred into it, which was the last of the sugar in the house, and he listened while the boy told what he knew. The Petersons had been out of food for 2 days. Wesley's father had gone down through the drifts on the 9th day and had found the store shut, and had come home and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. That evening, Wesley's mother had bundled the youngest child in every blanket in the house and had gone out herself, on foot, because she knew Margaret Halstead a little from the Methodist sewing circle, and because a woman she trusted had told her, in a whisper at church back in November, that the widow at the north edge of town had put by more food than one woman could eat in a lifetime. Wesley's mother had come home 3 hours later with a covered basket. Inside the basket was a small crock of rendered fat, a paper of dried beans, a wedge of hard white cheese wrapped in cloth, and half a pound of smoked beef. She had also brought back a message. The widow Halstead had told her that anyone in Cotter's Reach who could reach her kitchen would be fed, and that anyone who could not reach it should send word by any child who could, and that the food would last as long as it needed to last. Wesley had come this morning to tell his uncle, who lived 2 doors down from Mullen's store. He had told his uncle, and then he had thought, standing in the wind outside his uncle's door, that perhaps Mr. Mullen should be told as well. Frank Mullen said nothing for a long time after the boy finished. He sat across the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a tin cup that had gone cold, and he looked at the plank floor between his boots, and something moved through him that he did not have a name for, and would not find a name for, until he was an old man sitting on a different porch in a different summer telling the story to a grandchild who would not quite believe it. He sent the boy home with a scarf of his own wife's around the child's face, and he closed the door behind him, and he stood in his own kitchen for a while. Then he put on his heavy coat and his fur hat and the mittens his wife had made him the winter Samuel Halstead was dying, and he went out into the storm. The walk to Margaret's gate was 1.5 miles by the road, but the road was gone. Frank Mullen went by fence lines where fence lines were still visible, and by the tops of buried outbuildings where they were not, and twice he lost his bearings entirely and stood in the white with the wind cutting through his coat, and had to wait for a break in the driving snow to find a landmark. It took him nearly 2 hours to cover the distance. When he finally saw the thin, steady thread of smoke rising from Margaret's chimney, he stopped in the drift at her gate and stood there for a full minute before he could bring himself to open it. The gate was clear. Someone had shoveled it. The path to the front door was clear as well, packed hard by many feet, and the door itself, when he raised his hand to knock, opened before his knuckles touched the wood. Margaret stood in the doorway in a plain gray dress with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a smear of flour across the front of her apron. Behind her, the kitchen was warm and full of light and full of people. Frank could see them past her shoulder. A woman he did not know sitting at the table with a child in her lap. 2 of the Riley girls on the bench by the stove, wrapped in a quilt he recognized as Margaret's own. A man he thought was one of the Ostergaards asleep in the rocking chair by the wall, with his boots off and his stockinged feet stretched toward the fire. Margaret looked at Frank Mullen for a long, quiet moment. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in, Mr. Mullen," she said. "You will not stand in my cold." He came in. He stood on the boot mat inside her door with the snow melting off his coat in a slow puddle around his feet, and he could not for a moment meet her eyes. Margaret took his coat from his shoulders without asking. She hung it on a peg by the door beside 3 others that did not belong to her, and she took his hat and his mittens and set them on a shelf above the wood box to dry. Then she turned him toward the stove with a hand at his elbow, the way a woman might turn a child who had come in from the cold, and she put him on a stool by the fire and pressed a tin mug of hot broth into his hands before he had thought to ask for anything at all. The broth was rich. It tasted of smoked beef and onion and something faintly sweet he could not place, and it warmed him from the inside out in a way that no fire alone could have done. He drank it slowly. He looked around the kitchen while he drank. There were 14 people in the room, he counted, not including Margaret and himself. 3 of them were children. 2 were old. The rest were somewhere in the middle, the ordinary faces of a town he had lived in for 15 years, and every one of them looked at him with an expression he had not expected and did not know how to answer. They were not angry. That was the thing that struck him hardest, sitting there on the stool by the widow's stove with the broth going down warm inside him. They had every right to be angry. Every one of them had come to his store on credit at some point in the last 2 years, and every one of them had signed a note against something they owned, and every one of them had walked past his shut door in the last week and known that the man who had extended that credit was now sitting inside his own house with his own family fed while the rest of the town starved. They had every right to look at him the way a jury looks at a man on trial. They did not. They looked at him the way people look at a neighbor who has finally found his way home. That was Margaret's doing. He understood that within the first 10 minutes of sitting in her kitchen. She had set the tone of the room, and the room had followed her, and the room was not a room for judgment. It was a room for eating and for resting and for keeping small children warm, and there was no space in it for a reckoning. She fed him. She refilled the tin mug when he emptied it, and she cut him a slice of dark bread from a loaf that had come out of her oven that morning, and she spread the bread with a thick pale butter that he realized after the first bite was not butter at all but the rendered beef fat she had put by in the autumn, whipped smooth with salt and a little wild garlic. He ate 2 slices. He would have eaten 4 if she had offered them, but she did not, and he understood without being told that the portions in this kitchen were being measured against a number of days no one yet knew. She spoke to him while he ate, not about the store, not about the credit book, about small things. About the weather, which she said would break within the week because she had seen crows moving east that morning through a gap in the storm, and the crows in her mother's country had always known before the men did. About the Ostergaard baby, who was sleeping in the back room under 3 of Margaret's own blankets, and who had come in the day before with a fever that had broken in the night. About the bay mare, who was warm in the barn and eating the last of the good hay, and would need to be turned out to browse the willows along the creek before the month was out. She did not ask him for anything. She did not tell him what the room had been eating, or how much was left in the ground, or what she planned to do when the storm broke and the town came to her gate in numbers larger than her kitchen could hold. She simply fed him, and she talked to him the way she would have talked to any tired neighbor who had come in from the cold, and when he had finished the second slice of bread, she took the empty mug from his hands and set it on the sideboard. Then she asked him, quietly, if he would help her carry a jar up from the yard. He followed her out through the back door in his shirt sleeves, because she had taken his coat and had not given it back, and had said, with the small quiet smile of a woman who had already decided a thing, that the walk was short, and a man his size would not freeze in the 20 steps between her kitchen and her barn. The wind had dropped in the last hour. The snow still fell, but it fell straight down now, in the fat lazy flakes of a storm losing its strength, and Frank Mullen understood as he crossed the yard behind her that she had been right about the crows. She led him past the barn to a place along its south wall where the drift had been dug back in a neat square. A wooden trapdoor lay flush with the ground beneath the cleared snow. Margaret bent and lifted it, and Frank saw the top of a ladder going down into the dark and a lantern already burning at the bottom. She went down first. He followed her. The trench was not what he had pictured through the summer, standing on his porch with a cigar and laughing at a woman he had never bothered to understand. It was not a hole. It was a room. A long, narrow, carefully cut room in the earth, walled with plank on the sides and roofed with plank above, and along its length, packed into beds of clean straw, stood row upon row of the clay jars he had watched come off the freight wagon in August. There were more of them than he had known she had ordered. There were, at a rough count in the yellow light of the lantern, well over 100 jars, and only perhaps a dozen of them stood empty and tipped against the far wall. Margaret walked past him along the row. She stopped near the far end and lifted down a jar he had not seen from the ladder, a jar that stood a little apart from the others on a low wooden shelf set into the earth wall. It was smaller than the food jars. It was sealed with wax in the same way and stoppered with the same plug of hardwood, but there was no paper label tied around its neck. She held it in both hands for a moment, and then she turned and looked at Frank Mullen across the lantern light. "This one," she said, "is for you." He did not understand her. He said so. She did not answer him. She climbed the ladder with the small jar cradled against her chest, and he came up after her, and she closed the trapdoor and packed a thin layer of snow back across it with the side of her boot before she led him back to the kitchen. The room was quieter now. Two of the children had fallen asleep on the bench by the wall. The Ostergaard man was still in the rocking chair. Margaret's people, Frank thought, and did not know why the word had come into his head that way. She set the small jar on the kitchen table. She took a paring knife from the sideboard and worked the wax seal loose, and she drew the wooden stopper out with the flat of her hand. Then she turned the jar upside down over the table and shook it once, gently. A folded square of paper fell out onto the wood. Frank looked at it. He looked at Margaret. She said nothing. She only nodded once toward the paper, and he understood that he was meant to open it, and he sat down at her table with the eyes of 14 people on his back and unfolded the square with hands that had begun, without his permission, to shake. It was a deed. He knew it before he had finished unfolding it, because he had seen the shape of that particular sheet of paper before in his father's desk when he was a boy, and he had seen the seal of the county recorder in the corner of it, and he knew, with the cold, sick certainty of a man who has just recognized a thing he has spent 30 years not looking at, exactly what the paper was going to say before his eye reached the words. It was the original deed to the creek pasture. The 40 acres of good bottom land along the Musselshell that ran east from Margaret's fence line to the county road. The land Frank Mullen had ridden past 100 times in his life and had, at Samuel Halstead's funeral, already begun to count as his own. The name on the deed was not his father's. The name on the deed was Samuel Halstead's. Frank Mullen sat at the widow's table for a long time with the paper in his hands, and the kitchen was very quiet around him. He read the deed once. He read it again. The date at the top was April of 1879, 3 years before his father had died, 3 years before the county records had been quietly amended in a courthouse 30 miles away, 3 years before the creek pasture had passed into Mullen ownership through a transaction that Samuel Halstead had spent the last 9 years of his life trying and failing to overturn in court. He knew the story. He had known it since he was 19 years old, when his father had sat him down in the back room of the store and had told him, over a glass of the same rye whiskey Frank now kept in his own desk, how the creek pasture had come to them. His father had not been proud of it. His father had not been ashamed of it either. It had been, in the old man's telling, the kind of thing a practical man did once and then did not do again, and the boy Frank had understood that he was being shown the shape of the family and being asked whether he would carry it. He had carried it. He had carried it through 15 years of running the store and through Samuel Halstead's slow dying, and through the funeral in April where he had stood with his hat in his hand, and his eyes on land that had never, in law or in justice, belonged to his family at all. And Margaret had known. She had known the whole time. He looked up from the paper. Margaret was standing across the table from him with her hands folded in front of her apron, and her face was not the face of a woman about to take a thing back. It was the face of a woman who had already decided what she meant to do and was waiting only for him to catch up. She held out her hand. He gave her the deed. She walked to the stove. She opened the small iron door with the poker, and the coals inside glowed red and orange against her gray dress, and she tore the paper in half across its middle with two sharp movements of her hands. She held the two halves over the open fire for a moment. Then she dropped them in. The paper caught at once. It curled black at the edges and flared briefly and was gone. She closed the stove door. She turned back to the room. "Debts freeze too, Mr. Mullen," she said, and her voice carried the soft weight of the country she had come from, and it carried something else Frank Mullen would not have a name for until he was a much older man. "Let this one die tonight." He did not answer her. He could not. He sat at her table with his hands flat on the wood in front of him, and he wept, quietly, without covering his face, in a room full of neighbors who had every reason to hate him and who did not. Margaret let him weep. She did not touch him. She only stood by the stove with her hands folded, and when he had finished she brought him his coat and his hat and his mittens and helped him into them at the door. He hauled her firewood for the rest of that winter. He hauled it from his own woodshed, on his own back, through drifts that broke and reformed and broke again as the storm finally spent itself in the second week of February. He hauled it in silence, and he stacked it against her south wall in neat rows, and he did not ask her for anything, and she did not ask him for anything. And by the time the thaw came in April, the two of them had reached a kind of understanding that did not need words to hold it up. By the middle of May, the town had built her a proper cellar house. Elias Cavett drew the plans. Every man in Cotter's Reach who could swing a hammer took a day of the work. Frank Mullen took 4. The cellar house stood behind Margaret's barn, on the exact ground where the trenches had been, and it was fitted with plank shelves along both walls and a heavy oak door that closed against the frost, and Margaret filled it that autumn with jars enough to feed a town. She lived in the house Samuel had built for her until 1923. The cellar house is still standing. The mountain does not forget. Neither, it turned out, did the ground. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video, leave a comment about the part that reached you, and subscribe for more stories. Peace.